Phu Min Village, a humble countryside along the banks of the Red River, is where Mrs. Cook has spent her entire life. Her small, time-worn house is nestled amid lush vegetable gardens and rows of ancient trees that provide shade during the scorching summers. This modest setting is a reflection of her simple and enduring life. Mrs. Cook, an overburdened widow, has faced countless hardships. From a young age, she single-handedly raised her only son, Thang, pouring all her love, effort, and hope into his future. Thang was her pride, the light of her life, and the sole reason she endured years of back-breaking labor. When he was just a child, Mrs. Cook toiled day and night, juggling various jobs. From planting rice in the fields to weaving mats for hire, she worked tirelessly. "I only hope my son can receive an education," she often thought, her hands worn and calloused. But no matter how hard she tried, the harsh hand of poverty seemed impossible to escape. Despite her sacrifices, fate seemed unjust. Thang grew up witnessing his mother's silent endurance and selflessness. It was clear to him how much she gave up for his sake. But Thang was a quiet, reserved person by nature, easily influenced by others and hesitant to voice his opinions. As he matured, Mrs. Cook couldn't help but worry about his future. She noticed with an aching heart that while most young men in the village had already married, Thang remained alone. Whispers began to circulate among the neighbors. "Thang's family is so poor. No girl would want to marry him," they said. Mrs. Cook tried to ignore these remarks, but they stung deeply. She knew the reality of their poverty, and the thought that her son might remain unmarried weighed heavily on her heart. Determined to give him a better life, she decided to take matters into her own hands. Through a local matchmaker, Mrs. Cook was introduced to Ha, a young woman from a neighboring village. Ha was well known for her beauty and intelligence, but at nearly 30 years old, she was still unmarried, a fact that caused her family some concern. Although Mrs. Cook was well aware that Ha's family looked down on their humble circumstances, she was resolute. With trembling hands, she gathered her modest savings and approached Ha's family to propose the match. At first, Ha seemed indifferent, but after witnessing Mrs. Cook's genuine humility and admiration, she finally agreed. The wedding was a simple affair, no lavish celebrations or extravagant displays. A few trays of food were prepared, and neighbors gathered to share in the joy. For Mrs. Cook, it was the happiest day of her life. Her heart swelled with hope as she imagined a future filled with the laughter of children and the comfort of having someone to rely on in her old age. Yet, reality after the wedding was far from Mrs. Cook's dreams. From the moment Ha became a daughter-in-law, she showed little affection for her poor mother-in-law. Ha's disdain was evident in her sharp words and cold demeanor. "This house is so small and suffocating," Ha remarked one day, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Don't you feel uncomfortable, Mother?" Each word cut Mrs. Cook like a knife, but she only smiled awkwardly, unwilling to create conflict. Thang, who witnessed his wife's behavior, said nothing. He had always been timid, and now he was entirely under Ha's influence. Ha soon grew bolder, issuing an ultimatum to Thang. "If your mother doesn't leave, I will." She pressured him relentlessly, making cruel insinuations that left Mrs. Cook feeling increasingly unwanted. "If your mother stays here," Ha said one evening, her voice cold and biting, "don't expect to ever hold grandchildren in your arms. I can't stand the sight of her wandering around like a ghost." Those words were the final blow to Mrs. Cook. She realized that as long as she stayed, her son's happiness would remain out of reach. After a sleepless night of reflection, she made the hardest decision of her life. Quietly, she began packing her few belongings, a handful of old clothes, some coins she had saved, and the worn scarf Thang had gifted her years ago. With tears streaming down her face, Mrs. Cook glanced around the small home that had been her entire world. It wasn't much, but it had been filled with her love, her dreams, and her sacrifices. Now she had to leave it all behind. for Thang's sake. As dawn broke, she stepped out of the house, her heart heavy but resolute, carrying with her only the hope that her departure would bring her son the happiness she had always wanted for him. Her eyes were swollen and red as she looked around the house one last time. Every corner of this place was filled with memories. She had built it with so much sweat and so many tears, and now she was being forced to leave it behind. Thang stood quietly outside the door, his hands clenched into fists. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in his throat. Pei stood beside him, arms folded, her cold, sharp gaze like a silent command, urging her to leave quickly. "You stay here and live well. Don't worry about me," Mrs. Cook said softly, her voice almost lost in the sound of the night wind. She turned to her son, her eyes filled with sadness, but Thang didn't look up. He stood there, silent, his head bowed. Mrs. Cook's frail figure slowly faded into the mist. Her shadow grew smaller and smaller, leaving behind only the faint, dragging sound of her worn-out rubber sandals on the village road. The night swallowed her whole, and the house she once called home now stood behind her, silent and empty. The road ahead was dark, stretching endlessly into the unknown. Mrs. Cook kept walking, her legs trembling with each step. Tears streamed down her face, but she held them back, biting her lip. Her heart felt like it was being torn apart, but she told herself to stay strong. "For my son," she whispered under her breath. For him, she was willing to endure anything. The cold wind bit into her skin as she walked through the night. Exhausted, she eventually collapsed by the edge of a field. She looked up at the sky, which was beginning to lighten. Dawn was breaking, but her heart felt heavier than ever. This was the beginning of a journey she had never imagined she would have to take. Back at the house, Ha let out a sigh of relief. With her poor mother-in-law gone, she thought life would finally be more comfortable. But Thang couldn't sleep. He sat quietly in the corner of their bed, staring at the dark alley where his mother had disappeared. His heart was filled with regret, but his weakness, his inability to stand up to Ha, had stopped him from keeping her there that night. Far from home, Mrs. Cook wandered through unfamiliar paths, her figure disappearing into the cold northern winter. Her shoulders trembled under the weight of the bitter cold. The rubber sandals on her feet were worn down to the sole, and she had no idea where she was going or what she would do. But she kept repeating to herself, "I can't go back. If I go back, it will only make my son's family more miserable." As morning broke, she reached a small district market. Her stomach growled with hunger, and she felt lightheaded. Kneeling down next to a food vendor's basket, she hesitated. The vendor, noticing her desperation, handed her a small donut. "Here, take this," he said kindly. Tears welled up in her eyes as she thanked him profusely. The small act of kindness warmed her heart in the coldness of her new reality. She kept walking, passing through endless rice fields and red dirt roads coated in dust. By the time the sun set, she was utterly exhausted. She stumbled upon an old bridge by the river, where farmers had built small huts to rest during harvest season. Sitting down on the ground, she pulled her tattered wool scarf over her face, but the icy wind still pierced through her clothes, chilling her to the bone. That night, sleep evaded her. Her thoughts were consumed by images of Thang's old house and Ha's cold, unyielding eyes. Each memory stabbed at her heart. In the days that followed, Mrs. Cook barely survived. She scavenged for cicadas and begged for scraps at nearby markets. She endured the disdainful stares of the villagers without saying a word. Her head hung low. One afternoon, as she sat beneath the bridge, she noticed a small child, no more than 6 or 7, sobbing uncontrollably. He had gotten separated from his parents. Gently, she approached him, spoke soothing words, and helped reunite him with his worried family. In gratitude, they gave her a piece of bread and a small bottle of water. That simple act of kindness reminded her that she still had value, even in her broken state. After nearly a month of living under the bridge, Mrs. Kook knew she couldn't stay there forever. On a particularly cold day, her health began to deteriorate. Her thin, frail body trembled with fever. She realized she had to leave, no matter how daunting the journey ahead seemed. One morning, with her condition worsening, Mrs. Kook made up her mind to head for the city. She hoped to find work, even though she had no idea what awaited her there. Her legs were weak and wobbly, but she kept moving forward. Each step was a struggle, her body worn down by exhaustion and hunger. Still, she refused to stop. The road to the city stretched out before her, a symbol of both hope and uncertainty. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she had to keep going, for herself, for her son, for the chance to survive another day. She thought her suffering had finally come to an end. Life had already thrown so much at her, and she couldn't imagine facing anything worse. But that belief began to crumble the very moment she stepped foot into the bustling city. The world before her was overwhelming. Chaotic roads packed with honking vehicles, towering buildings squeezed together, and bright, unrelenting neon lights. The scene was a stark contrast to the small, quiet, and impoverished village she had called home her entire life. Yet despite the glittering luxury that surrounded her, she knew deep down it wasn't meant for someone like her. Huddled on the crowded sidewalk, she stood there awkwardly, observing the rush of life around her. People hurried past without even glancing her way, as if she were invisible. Her tattered clothes and frail appearance blended into the shadows of the city. That night, she found herself crouching under a cold, dark overpass for shelter. The frigid wind swept up from the nearby river, cutting through her thin layers and making her shiver uncontrollably. But she gritted her teeth and stayed silent. Complaining wouldn't help. She had no one to hear her cries and nowhere else to go. The next morning, while wandering the streets, her attention was caught by the aroma of roasted sweet potatoes. Her stomach growled as she followed the scent and found an elderly man pushing a cart loaded with freshly roasted sweet potatoes. Hesitantly, she approached him, her hunger getting the better of her. The old man noticed her immediately. After a long look, he asked, "Where are you from, and why do you look so thin and tired?" She introduced herself as Mrs. Kuck and briefly explained her dire circumstances. The old man listened intently, his face clouding with concern. After a thoughtful pause, he said, "If you don't want to starve, you have to learn to make a living. Begging isn't the way. If you're willing, I'll teach you how to roast sweet potatoes and sell them. It's better than sitting here with no hope." Mrs. Kuck was taken aback by his words. For a moment, she was speechless, but then, as his offer sank in, a tiny spark of hope ignited in her heart. It had been months, long, grueling months, since anyone had shown her kindness or offered to help her. She nodded, and from that moment, her life began to take a turn. In the days that followed, she worked closely with the old man, learning everything he knew about roasting sweet potatoes. He showed her how to pick the best potatoes, light the fire properly, and roast them to perfection. He even accompanied her to the wholesale market, helping her find the cheapest deals on potatoes and coal. To give her a fresh start, he lent her some money to buy a small second-hand oven. His advice was simple but profound. Be patient and frugal, and you'll make it through. Taking his words to heart, Mrs. Kuck threw herself into her new work. She began pushing her cart through the streets, selling roasted sweet potatoes from dawn until late at night. Each day was grueling, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was doing something meaningful. Despite the hardship, her life slowly stabilized. However, the cold winter months were especially harsh. The freezing winds seemed to seep into every bone, keeping her awake through many sleepless nights. One particularly cold day, her body finally gave in. Exhausted and weak, she collapsed next to her cart. Concerned passers-by rushed to help, calling an ambulance to take her to the hospital. When she regained consciousness, she felt deeply touched by their kindness, but she was also overcome by guilt. She didn't want to be a burden to anyone. So that very night, against the advice of the doctors, she quietly left the hospital and returned to her cart. She had work to do. As the months turned into years, Mrs. Cuck became a familiar figure in the neighborhood. Her sweet potato cart became a staple on the busy streets, and many locals, especially office workers, would stop by regularly to buy from her. They admired her unwavering diligence and warm demeanor. Some even bought extra potatoes simply to support her. Her hard work paid off, and more often than not, she sold out her goods early in the day. People encouraged her to take it easy and rest, but she would always smile and say, "I'm old, but as long as I have strength, I'll keep working. It keeps me alive." Despite the years of hardship, Mrs. Cuck never resented her life. She bore no grudges against her son or daughter-in-law who had abandoned her. "Everyone has their struggles," she often said to herself. "As long as I live well and honestly, that's all that matters." Her life was simple, but her resilience gave her the strength to endure the darkest days. Unbeknownst to her, the quiet, tireless efforts she put into her work were paving the way for a brighter chapter. Over time, her once meager existence began to blossom into something more secure. Her roasted sweet potato cart not only provided her with a steady income, but also gave her a sense of purpose in the bustling city. Hunger, which had haunted her in the early days of her wandering, was no longer a constant companion. Though life still had its challenges, Mrs. Cuck carried on with a quiet determination. She developed a habit of saving every single penny she earned. After finishing her sales for the day, she would carefully count her money and tuck it away in an old iron box, her precious treasure. That treasure wasn't meant for luxuries or indulgences. Mrs. Cuck was as frugal as they came. She continued to wear the same patched sweater she had owned for years and walked in worn-out sandals that had seen better days. For her, these simple belongings were enough. Every coin she saved was for emergencies, or perhaps for building a more secure future. Her life may have seemed ordinary to others, but to Mrs. Cuck, it was more than enough. The strength of her spirit had carried her through unimaginable hardships. And though her past was marked by struggles and loss, her unwavering hope and perseverance proved that even in the harshest of circumstances, it's possible to find purpose, joy, and peace. One day, an unexpected event completely changed Mrs. Cuck's life. That morning started just like any other. Mrs. Cuck, with her old cart full of sweet potatoes, made her way to the familiar street corner where she had worked for years. The air was biting cold, and a sharp wind slipped through the thin fabric of her worn-out shirt, sending shivers through her small frame. Despite the chill, she lit her tiny fire with practiced hands, preparing to roast sweet potatoes as she had done countless times before. Across the street, a group of children laughed and played, their giggles carrying through the crisp morning air. Among them was a little girl, no more than 5 years old, with bright eyes and a playful spirit. She was so engrossed in chasing a bouncing ball that she didn't notice the busy road nearby. The traffic was relentless that morning, cars, motorbikes, and trucks honking as they weaved past each other. The girl's ball rolled dangerously close to the road, and without a second thought, she darted after it. Mrs. Cuck noticed immediately. Her heart stopped as she saw the truck hurtling down the street, and without hesitation, she dropped everything. The clip she had been holding fell from her hand as she rushed toward the child. With all her strength, she scooped the little girl up in her arms and pulled her to safety just as the truck roared past. They tumbled to the ground together, both shaken but unharmed. A crowd quickly gathered around them. People helped them to their feet, murmuring words of concern and admiration. Then, from among the bystanders, a middle-aged couple ran toward the little girl, their faces pale with panic. The woman dropped to her knees and hugged her daughter tightly, while the man turned to Mrs. Cuck with tears of gratitude in his eyes. Thank you so much for saving our child." they said, their voices trembling with emotion. Mrs. Cuck brushed off their thanks with a gentle smile. "It's nothing," she replied humbly. Anyone would have done the same. But her bravery had left a deep impression on the couple, who introduced themselves as the owners of a popular restaurant chain in the city. Seeing Mrs. Cuck's modest appearance and kind heart, they felt a strong urge to help her. At first, Mrs. Cuck politely declined their offer. "I've lived frugally my whole life," she said. "I don't need much, and I don't want to trouble anyone." But the couple's sincerity eventually won her over. They helped her secure a small stall in a bustling market near the city center, providing her with the chance to expand her humble business. From that day on, Mrs. Cuck's life began to change. No longer confined to a street corner, her stall became a cozy spot where customers would gather not just for the food, but also to meet the kind-hearted woman whose story had touched so many. Word spread quickly about the compassionate old lady who had saved a child, and soon, people from all over the city came to taste her roasted sweet potatoes. As her business grew, so did her menu. She began offering grilled corn, crispy fried dumplings, and warm cakes, perfect treats for the cold winter days. Each dish carried the same rustic simplicity, but was infused with Mrs. Cuck's care and sincerity. Her little stall, once a modest operation, now buzzed with activity as customers lined up, eager to taste her homemade delicacies. Despite the growing success, Mrs. Cuck remained true to her roots. Every morning, she still roasted sweet potatoes by hand, a quiet reminder of how far she had come. "Never forget where you started," she often whispered to herself. With her growing income, she was able to hire helpers, but she continued to personally oversee everything, ensuring that her food was made with the same love and dedication as when she first started. In just a few short years, Mrs. Cuck had accumulated a surprising amount of savings. One day, she went to the bank to deposit her earnings. The staff couldn't hide their astonishment when this unassuming woman, dressed in simple clothes, walked in with such a large sum of money. But to Mrs. Cuck, this money wasn't just for her, it had a purpose. She used her savings to set up a small charity dedicated to helping the elderly and disadvantaged children she often encountered on the streets. "There are so many people who need a helping hand just like I once did," she said softly. She also reached out to support street vendors like herself, knowing all too well the struggles they face daily. Her compassion touched countless lives, and her charity became a beacon of hope for the vulnerable in her community. Mrs. Cuck never stopped growing, both as a person and as a businesswoman. She took the time to learn new recipes, discovered how to manage her finances better, and always maintained an open mind. From a poor, struggling street vendor, she had transformed into a role model of resilience and generosity. Her story even caught the attention of the local press, who published an article celebrating her journey and calling her a woman of great compassion. But no matter how far she had come, Mrs. Cuck never forgot her humble beginnings. Late at night, when the market had quieted down, she often thought of her small home in Pu Min Village and her estranged family, her son Thong and his wife. Though they had parted ways, she held no bitterness in her heart. She had come to peace with the life she had chosen. "If fate has brought me here," she often told herself, "then I will live fully in the present with no regrets." Mrs. Cuck's story is one of courage, kindness, and an unshakable will to rise above life's challenges. Through her actions, she became not just a success, but a source of inspiration for everyone who crossed her path. The story of Mrs. Cuck continued to spread throughout Pu Min Village, becoming a topic of conversation in every household. Whispers about her success filled the air. Some claimed she had accumulated an enormous fortune, while others speculated that her life was now filled with luxury. Yet, for Mrs. Cuck, the greatest treasure she possessed was not money or material wealth, but the spiritual values she had nurtured through years of struggle and growth. She understood that living a meaningful and purposeful life held far more value than chasing after fleeting, frivolous possessions. One quiet evening, as Mrs. Cuck sat at her modest restaurant counter, surrounded by the hum of bustling customers, she smiled. She reflected on her incredible journey, from a woman cast out of her home in poverty to someone respected and loved by all who crossed her path. Despite the hardships she endured, she felt no resentment or regret. Every challenge had been a lesson, every person she encountered a teacher, and every tear a stepping stone towards something greater. Now, more than ever, she felt at peace, as though she had finally discovered the place where she belonged. Her story of resilience and transformation eventually reached far beyond the borders of Pu Min. It even found its way back to the ears of Ha and Thang, her son and daughter-in-law. One evening, as their 10-year-old son returned home from school, he excitedly shared what he had heard from his teacher. "Grandma is famous now," he exclaimed. "The teacher said she's living in a big, rich city and owns a very popular restaurant. She's even in the newspapers." Ha and Thang exchanged bewildered glances. Their son's innocent words left them stunned and doubtful. Ha, in particular, couldn't believe that the woman they had once cast out with nothing could now be thriving in wealth and fame. Desperate for answers, she questioned her son further, her tone skeptical but tinged with curiosity. "Who told you this story? Are you sure it's your grandma?" she asked. "Yes," the boy replied confidently. "The village chief just came back from the city. He told my teacher that Grandma owns a famous restaurant and earns billions of dong." That statement hit Ha like a bolt of lightning. Her heart raced as disbelief and guilt mingled within her. She immediately dragged Thang to the village chief's house to seek clarification. When they arrived, the village chief confirmed the astonishing news. "Yes, it's true," he said with a warm smile. "I met Mrs. Cuck in the city. She's doing very well, respected and admired for her kindness. She helps a lot of poor people. I also heard she has saved over 20 billion dong in the bank." Ha felt her legs go weak. Her mind swirled with shock, regret, and a sudden, urgent thought. She needed to bring Mrs. Cuck back. Turning to Thang, she spoke with a trembling voice filled with remorse. "Thang, you see, Mom is amazing. We can't leave her like this anymore. We have to bring her back home so she can live with her children and grandchildren. If she needs help, it'll be easier when she's with us." Thang, who had long carried a quiet guilt for how his mother had been treated, simply nodded. The regret in his eyes matched his wife's. Without hesitation, they made a plan to visit her. The very next morning, Ha and Thang set off for the city. They carried a basket of fresh fruits from their village, hoping it would serve as a peace offering. On the journey, Ha repeatedly urged Thang to apologize sincerely to his mother. "You have to admit your mistakes," she insisted. "She'll forgive you if you show her how much you regret everything." When they finally arrived at Mrs. Cook's restaurant, they were stunned. It was a charming little shop located on a busy street corner, bustling with customers. The sign above read in simple words, "Mother's Strange Shop." The delicious aroma of grilled sweet potatoes filled the air, accompanied by cheerful laughter from the patrons. Ha and Thang stood frozen outside the shop, unable to believe their eyes. Behind the counter, Mrs. Cuck was gracefully grilling sweet potatoes, her hands moving with practiced ease. She looked different from how they remembered her. Her hair was now completely white and her frame thinner, but her eyes sparkled with a calm and lively energy. For a moment, Thang couldn't find the words to speak. He stood silently, his throat tight with emotion. Finally, summoning his courage, he stepped forward and called out softly, "Mom, it's me. I'm here." Mrs. Cuck looked up. Her expression flickered with surprise, but only for a brief moment. Her face quickly settled into a serene, neutral gaze. She said nothing at first, only watching them intently. After a pause, she gently asked, "Why are you here?" What brings you to the city?" Before Thang could answer, Ha spoke up, her voice unusually sweet and pleading. "Mom, it's been so long. We've been so worried about you. Please come back home with us. You've worked so hard. You shouldn't have to do this anymore. Come live with your children and grandchildren. It'll be easier for all of us." Mrs. Cook's eyes lingered on Ha for a moment. Her gaze seemed to pierce straight through her daughter-in-law's heart, as though she could see the unspoken motives beneath her words. Yet she said nothing to reveal what she might be thinking. Instead, she smiled faintly, a smile filled with quiet wisdom and deep understanding. She remained silent, leaving Ha and Thang waiting anxiously for her response. "Thank you for taking care of me, but I'm used to being here. As long as I still have the strength, I will continue to work. You don't need to worry about me." "Mom, please reconsider," Thang said earnestly. "We really want to take you home with us. We know we were wrong before, but we've changed. Let us take care of you now." But Mrs. Cook didn't respond. She stood quietly, her expression unchanged. Then, without a word, she turned and went back inside to resume her work, leaving Thang and Ha standing there, stunned and silent. That afternoon, as the shop closed, they remained in a daze, their hearts heavy with unspoken emotions. Later that evening, Mrs. Cook finally invited them inside. She gestured to the small wooden table, offering them seats. Thang, unable to hold back his emotions, grabbed his mother's hand tightly. Tears streamed down his face as his voice broke. "Mom, I'm sorry," he said, choking on the words. "I was unfilial. I didn't protect you when I should have. I know I hurt you. Mom, please forgive me." Hearing his heartfelt apology, Mrs. Cook's expression softened. A gentle smile played on her lips. "I've never blamed you, Thang," she said quietly. "Everyone has their own path in life. You chose yours, and I chose mine." Ha, sitting nervously beside them, asked hesitantly, "Mom, I heard you've saved a lot of money over the years. Do you have any plans for it? Maybe we could help you manage it?" That question hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Mrs. Cook didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stood up, poured herself a cup of tea, and took a moment to collect her thoughts. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm but firm. "I've already decided what to do with my savings," she said. "I've donated everything to a charity fund to help the poor. I didn't keep a single penny for myself." Her words struck Ha like a lightning bolt. She sat there, stunned, her face pale with disbelief. "Mom, you gave everything away, everything?" "Yes," Mrs. Cook replied calmly. "But Mom, what about us?" Ha's voice rose, a mix of shock and anger. "We're your children too. Don't we matter to you?" Mrs. Cook met Ha's gaze, her eyes steady and full of meaning. "Money can be lost, Ha, but kindness lasts forever. What I've done is my way of repaying life for the blessings it has given me. I believe that if you work hard, you'll be able to take care of yourselves. You don't need to rely on me." Ha's face fell. She sat in silence, her mind racing. Beside her, Thang bowed his head, saying nothing. The small room seemed to close in around them as the weight of Mrs. Cook's words pressed heavily on their hearts. Mrs. Cook sighed deeply, her voice soft but unwavering. "I don't hold any grudges against you, but I want you to remember this. If you cannot maintain filial piety in this life, you will never find true happiness. Go home, live well. That is the greatest gift you can give me." The next day, Thang and Ha left without another word. Ha's face was etched with disappointment and regret, while Thang carried the weight of his shame like a heavy burden. From the small window of her shop, Mrs. Cook watched them walk away. Her expression was calm, but her eyes betrayed a hint of sadness. She didn't say anything, but in her heart, she silently hoped that they would one day understand the true value of life and learn to live better. As Thang and Ha walked home, an uncomfortable silence hung between them. Ha muttered under her breath, her words a bitter mix of anger and confusion. "Why would Mom do that? Why give it all away? Not even a single penny for us. We're her children, aren't we?" Thang said nothing. His shoulders were slumped, his head bowed low. His heart was heavy with regret and shame. For years he had thought about his mother but had never dared to seek her out, too afraid to face the pain of the past. Now, standing in the ruins of their relationship, he realized he had no right to blame her, no right to make demands. His mother had built her life with her own hands, and he could not take that away from her. Meanwhile, back in the city, Mrs. Cuck resumed her daily routine. She didn't dwell on the past or mention the encounter with her son and daughter-in-law to anyone. Instead, she focused on her work and her charity efforts, pouring her heart into the causes she believed in. Though a small part of her felt bitter about what had happened, she told herself that the past was behind her. Everything she had now was a result of her own strength, and she had no need to look back on old wounds. As time went on, life in Pullman Village continued as usual, but the story of Mrs. Cook became a hot topic of discussion. People were shocked to learn that the poor old woman who had been kicked out of her house years ago had become a successful and generous person. The gossip didn't stop there. Whenever Ha went to the market or crossed paths with the villagers, she could feel their eyes on her. Though no one said anything outright, their looks were enough to remind her of her past mistakes. The weight of their unspoken judgment made her feel small, as though she had destroyed something sacred with her own hands. At home, the atmosphere between Ha and Thang grew increasingly tense. Ha's dissatisfaction boiled over into frequent arguments, most of which revolved around money and Mrs. Cook's decision. She often blamed Thang, accusing him of failing to win back their mother's favor. Thang, on the other hand, was consumed by guilt. He didn't have the strength to argue back, choosing instead to bear the brunt of her anger in silence. The once sacred bond of their family seemed to unravel further with each passing day, leaving them trapped in a cycle of regret, blame, and discontent. And yet, in her quiet shop, Mrs. Cook continued her work with a sense of peace. She had made her choices, and she stood by them. Even as the shadows of the past lingered, she remained steadfast, believing that life's greatest blessings came not from holding on to material wealth, but from giving back and living with purpose. Perhaps, she thought, one day they would understand. Until then, she would continue forward, strong, resolute, and unbroken. If only that day he had been stronger, if only he had said a few kind words to his mother. Perhaps then, she wouldn't have walked away so empty-handed, so heartbroken, each time she heard his silence. Thang knew this too well. Ha had once told him that his silence was not just her fault, it was his weakness. And deep down, Thang agreed, but by the time he realized, it was already too late. One icy winter morning, Thang was visiting the village chief's home. The man entered with a solemn expression, holding a newspaper in his hand. "Read this," he said, handing it to Thang. The front page stopped him cold. A familiar face stared back at him, Mrs. Cuck, his mother. Above her photo, the bold headline read, "A kind-hearted woman donates everything before her passing." Thang's hands trembled as he absorbed the article. The words beneath the picture told the story of a woman who had been abandoned by her family, a woman who built a life for herself in the city, despite all the odds stacked against her. And now, the article revealed, she had passed away on a cold winter afternoon, alone. Her final act, donating all her hard-earned savings, over 2 billion dong, to charity. Thang sat on the cold ground, his vision blurred by tears. The newspaper slipped from his grasp as the realization hit him. The mother he had always thought was alive somewhere in the bustling city was now gone, forever. Ha's voice echoed sharply from the staircase above, her words cold and cutting. "Mom's dead?" she asked matter-of-factly. Then, who's going to inherit her money? Surely not us. The words struck like a dagger. Thang stood without replying, his heart heavy with grief and regret. Ha called after him, but he didn't look back. Instead, he hurried to the village chief, demanding the address of the hospital where his mother had been taken. He needed to know. He needed to go. That night, despite the frigid air and the long journey ahead, Thang left for the city. The entire trip was a blur of memories, painful, tender memories. He thought of his mother carrying him across endless fields when he was just a boy. He remembered the nights she stayed up late, tirelessly mending his torn clothes. And then, the last memory, a memory he could never forget, when she left their small, shabby home for the final time. He had stood there, silent, watching her go. By the time Thang reached the city, his regret had become an unbearable weight. He was guided to a small church by an elderly man, the same man who had once sold sweet potatoes. The man explained that Mrs. Cook had stayed in the city all those years, working tirelessly to build a small but stable life. Her strength, her perseverance, and her kindness had touched everyone she met. She always missed Thang, the man said, but she never returned home. She didn't want to burden him. Even in her last moments, she had hoped that Thang would live well, live with integrity, and be a son she could be proud of. Those words shattered Thang. He fell to his knees before a small portrait of his mother, tears streaming uncontrollably down his face. "Mom," he choked out, his voice breaking. "I was wrong. I'm so sorry." But no matter how loudly he cried, no matter how much he apologized, his words could never reach her. She was gone, forever. When Thang finally returned to the village, he carried his mother's ashes with him. Quietly, he placed them on the small altar in their old, worn-down house. He didn't speak to Ha. He didn't need to. For the next few days, Thang busied himself cleaning every corner of the home where his mother had once lived. He dusted the shelves, swept the floors, and lit incense at the altar each evening. Every night he sat by her ashes and whispered softly. He promised her he would live better. He would become the man she had always hoped he'd be. But deep in his heart, he knew that nothing, not his words, not his actions, could ever erase the regret he now carried. Ha, meanwhile, wrestled with her own emotions. Outwardly, she was bitter. How could her mother-in-law leave without leaving anything to them? But deep down, she knew the truth. She had been a part of the problem. It was her own greed and selfishness that had pushed Mrs. Cuck away. Yet, instead of facing this reality, she buried herself in resentment for what she believed she had lost. Life has a way of teaching us lessons, though often in the hardest of ways. Mrs. Cuck's life, and even her death, was a legacy far greater than the money she left behind. It was her strength, her resilience, her kindness, and her example of how to face adversity. Those who knew her admired her deeply, and those who hurt her, they would forever live with the scars of their actions. Even in death, Mrs. Cuck's presence lingered. On cold, windy nights, it felt as though her spirit was still there, whispering gentle reminders of life's greatest truths: kindness, forgiveness, and the unchanging law of cause and effect.